On a cold November morning in 1847, the household staff at Whitmore Plantation in Charleston County, South Carolina, discovered that their master was missing. The bed was made. The wardrobe was untouched. But Richard Whitmore, 43-year-old plantation owner, perfect husband and loving father of 4 children, had vanished as if he'd been swallowed by the earth itself. Search parties combed the surrounding forests for days, dragged the river for weeks, but they found nothing. No body, no clothing, no trace of what had happened to one of South Carolina's most respected gentlemen. Richard Whitmore had simply ceased to exist. But what made this disappearance truly disturbing wasn't the mystery of where Richard had gone. It was what his eldest son, Thomas, had been doing in the 6 months before his father vanished. The strange relationship that developed between Thomas and the new slave his father had purchased that summer. The nights Thomas spent in the woods, the blood on his clothes the morning his father disappeared. And most horrifying of all, what workers would discover buried in Whitmore Plantation's basement 5 years later when the property was sold. 12 skeletons, all young men, all buried in shallow graves beneath the stone floor. Richard Whitmore wasn't missing. He was dead. And the story of how he died, who killed him, and why, would expose a triangle of forbidden desire so twisted that 3 generations of the Whitmore family would pay lawyers' fortunes to keep the truth buried. What really happened in that plantation house during the summer and fall of 1847? What secret was Richard Whitmore hiding that drove him to murder 11 innocent men? And how did his own son discover the truth in time to become murderer number 12? Before we uncover the truth that the Whitmore family spent decades trying to erase from history, subscribe, hit that bell, and comment which state you're from below. Now, let me take you back to where this nightmare began. But before we get to how Thomas became a murderer, we need to understand the monster his father had already become. Because by August of 1847, Richard Whitmore had already killed 11 times, and he was about to purchase the one that would destroy everything. Charleston's slave market in August of 1847 operated with the brutal efficiency of any commodity exchange. The auction house on Queen Street, a 3-story brick building with iron-barred windows that cast prison shadows across the cobblestones, processed hundreds of human beings each week. The August heat was suffocating, trapped between brick walls and the humid air rolling in from the harbour, making breathing feel like drowning on dry land. The smell of unwashed bodies mingled with the sickly sweet scent of jasmine from the gardens of nearby mansions, creating a nauseating contrast that perfectly captured the moral rot at the heart of the antebellum South. Inside, the auction room was a theatre of human misery. Wealthy planters in their finest clothes, despite the heat, linen suits already dark with sweat stains, gathered to inspect the merchandise. Women in elaborate dresses fanned themselves while casually discussing which workers would be suitable for house service. The auctioneer's voice echoed off the walls, mixing with the rattle of chains and the quiet sobs of children being separated from their mothers. This was the machinery of slavery, operating openly, legally, with the full blessing of South Carolina law and custom. Richard Whitmore stood near the centre of the auction room that August afternoon, fanning himself with his hat in the oppressive heat. At 43, he embodied everything Southern aristocracy claimed to represent. His plantation generated over $60,000 annually, equivalent to nearly $2 million today. His wife, Catherine Montgomery Whitmore, came from one of Charleston's founding families, her lineage traceable back to the original colonial settlers. Their marriage, arranged when Catherine was just 18 and Richard 21, had been celebrated as a perfect union of 2 great families. It had produced 4 children: Thomas, 22, who had just returned from the University of Virginia with a law degree; Margaret, 19, already being courted by several suitable young men; James, 16, being groomed to help manage the plantation; and little Elizabeth, just 8 years old, the unexpected late blessing who had brought joy back to Catherine's life after years of dutiful but loveless marriage. To anyone who knew the family, the Whitmores represented perfection. Richard was a devoted father who read bedtime stories to his youngest daughter every night without fail, his deep voice bringing fairy tales to life in Elizabeth's imagination. He never missed a single one of James's riding lessons, patiently teaching his younger son the skills he would need to eventually manage workers and land. He hosted elegant dinner parties where he charmed guests with intelligent conversation about politics, literature, and agricultural innovations. He attended church every Sunday, sitting in the Whitmore family pew that had been purchased 3 generations earlier, singing hymns in a pleasant baritone that neighbours complimented. He treated his enslaved workers with what passed for mercy in 1847 South Carolina, meaning he rarely used the whip, provided adequate food and shelter, and allowed families to stay together when possible. He was, by all accounts, a good man. A Christian man. A gentleman, in the truest sense of the word. But Richard Whitmore was living a lie so profound, so all-consuming, that it was slowly crushing him from the inside out. Every smile he gave his wife was a performance. Every tender moment with his children was shadowed by the knowledge that they would hate him if they knew the truth. Every sermon he heard in church about sin and damnation felt like a knife twisting in his gut because he knew, absolutely knew, that he was damned. He had known since he was 15 years old that he was different. That summer, the summer of 1819, when his father had taken him to Charleston to learn the business of buying and selling human beings, Richard had experienced something that terrified him. One of the young men on the auction block, perhaps 19 or 20 years old, had looked at Richard with such profound sadness that Richard had felt something stir inside him. Not just sympathy or pity, but attraction, physical desire. The kind of feeling his friends described having for girls, but Richard felt for this enslaved young man whose name he never learned. That night, Richard had prayed until his knees bled on the rough wooden floor of his room. He had begged God to take away these unnatural urges, to make him normal, to let him feel what he was supposed to feel. When prayer didn't work, he tried other methods. He forced himself to court young women, to kiss them, to imagine a future with them. When that felt like torture, he whipped himself with his father's leather belt, trying to drive out the sin through physical pain. Nothing worked. At 21, under immense pressure from his father, who was eager to see the family line continued, Richard had married Catherine Montgomery. She was beautiful, accomplished, from an excellent family. Everything a man could want in a wife. On their wedding night, Richard had forced himself to consummate the marriage, his eyes closed, imagining someone else, anyone else. The shame of that night had haunted him for decades. But he had learned to perform, to play the role of devoted husband. He had fathered 4 children, each conception requiring him to retreat so deeply into fantasy that he could barely remember the acts themselves. Catherine never complained. She seemed content with a husband who was respectful, who provided for her, who didn't beat her or humiliate her as some of her friends' husbands did. She didn't know that their entire marriage was a carefully constructed facade hiding Richard's true nature. For 28 years, Richard had successfully buried who he really was. He had built his perfect life as a shield against the truth. He told himself that if he was good enough, moral enough, if he performed his role perfectly enough, then maybe the desires would eventually fade away. Maybe God would finally answer his prayers and make him normal. But lately, the shield was cracking. The facade was crumbling, and Richard was terrified. What Richard didn't know was that his carefully constructed life was about to collide with something he couldn't control. Someone who would see through his performance. Someone who would ultimately force his own son to make a choice between family loyalty and stopping a serial killer. But that collision was still months away. First, Richard had to kill Joseph. It had started 6 months earlier, in March of 1847, when Richard's youngest field hand, a 20-year-old named Joseph, had smiled at him in a certain way. It was nothing, really, just a polite smile as Joseph held the gate open for Richard to pass through. But something in that smile, some quality Richard couldn't even articulate, had awakened feelings he thought he had successfully killed decades ago. Richard began finding excuses to speak with Joseph. He needed to discuss crop rotation. He wanted to check on the condition of the east fields. He had questions about equipment maintenance. Each excuse brought him closer to Joseph, allowed him to spend more time in the young man's presence. Richard told himself it was innocent. He was just being a conscientious plantation owner, taking interest in his workers. There was nothing wrong with conversation, but the feelings grew stronger, more insistent, more impossible to ignore. Richard found himself thinking about Joseph at dinner, during church services, late at night when Catherine was asleep beside him. He started going to the fields more often, watching Joseph work from a distance, memorizing the way he moved, the sound of his laughter when he joked with other workers. It was obsession, though Richard refused to call it that. He called it interest, curiosity, concern for a valuable worker. The breaking point came on a warm evening in late March. Richard had been drinking alone in his study, trying to numb the constant war raging inside his head. The alcohol loosened the chains he kept wrapped around his true self. When he heard that Joseph was working late, repairing a fence near the southern boundary, Richard found himself walking toward the work site without consciously deciding to do so. Joseph was alone, hammering a post into place, his shirt removed in the evening heat. Richard stood at the edge of the tree line, watching, and felt desire so powerful it physically hurt. For the first time in his adult life, Richard wanted something more than he wanted to maintain his carefully constructed facade. He approached Joseph, said he wanted to discuss work assignments for the next day, suggested they talk in Joseph's cabin, away from potential eavesdroppers who might overhear plantation business. Joseph, ever obedient, agreed without question. Why would he suspect his master's intentions? In the cabin, Richard offered Joseph whiskey from a flask he had brought. They sat on the rough wooden bench that served as Joseph's only furniture. They talked about crops, weather, plans for the spring planting, and then, emboldened by alcohol and desperate loneliness, Richard had placed his hand on Joseph's knee. The look on Joseph's face still haunted Richard's nightmares 6 months later. It wasn't anger or even fear at first. It was confusion. Complete, total confusion. Joseph pulled away, stood up, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding to horror as he realized what his master wanted from him. "Sir," Joseph said, his voice careful, controlled. "Sir, I think you've had too much to drink. Maybe you should go back to the house. Rest. We can talk about work tomorrow." Richard stood, the rejection hitting him like a physical blow. "Joseph, please, sir." Joseph's voice was firmer now, with an edge of panic. "Please just leave. I won't tell anyone about this. Just leave." And in that moment, Richard saw his entire life crumbling. If Joseph told anyone, even hinted at what had happened, Richard's reputation would be destroyed. His family would be ruined. He would be arrested, committed to an asylum or worse. Everything he had built, everything he had sacrificed would be gone. "You can't tell anyone," Richard said, his voice shaking. "I won't. I promise. Just please go." But Richard couldn't trust that promise. Couldn't trust that Joseph wouldn't eventually tell someone, that the story wouldn't spread. Fear and shame and desperation all combined into something dark and violent. Richard's hands found Joseph's throat before he consciously decided to reach for it. Joseph tried to fight, his superior youth and strength almost breaking Richard's grip. But Richard had the advantage of surprise and the madness of desperation. He squeezed, even as Joseph's eyes bulged and his face turned purple, squeezed until the struggling stopped, until Joseph's body went limp and collapsed to the floor. Richard stood over the corpse, his hands still trembling, his mind screaming at him. What had he done? What had he become? He had just murdered an innocent man. Murdered him because Richard couldn't control himself, couldn't accept rejection, couldn't risk the truth being exposed. He should have felt horror, guilt, remorse. And he did feel those things, but underneath them was something else. Relief. Joseph could never tell anyone now. The secret was safe. Richard's life, his family, his reputation, all of it was safe. The disposal of the body was easier than Richard expected. He waited until well after midnight, then carried Joseph's body to the plantation house basement. The basement had a large storage area with a dirt floor in the far corner, hidden behind old furniture and crates. Richard dug by lantern light, his back aching, his hands blistering. It took hours to dig a grave deep enough. He rolled Joseph's body into it, covered it with dirt, then carefully rearranged the storage items to hide any signs of disturbance. The next morning, Richard announced that Joseph had run away during the night. It wasn't uncommon for enslaved workers to attempt escape, though few succeeded. Richard made a show of being angry about losing a valuable worker, even sent out search parties he knew would find nothing. Within a week, everyone had stopped talking about Joseph's disappearance. Within a month, it was as if Joseph had never existed. For weeks afterward, Richard was consumed by guilt and terror. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything. He saw Joseph's face every time he closed his eyes, felt phantom hands around his own throat. He told himself it had been an accident, a moment of panic, something that would never happen again. He swore to God, to himself, to the ghost of the man he had killed, that he would never let his desires control him again. But here's what Richard didn't understand about himself yet. The guilt wasn't strong enough to stop him. Because underneath the horror and shame, there was something else growing. A dark satisfaction, a sense of control he had never experienced before. He had eliminated a threat and gotten away with it completely. The addiction had begun, and it would claim 10 more victims before anyone suspected the truth. But 2 months later, Richard went to the Charleston slave market and purchased Marcus. Marcus was a 19-year-old with dark eyes and a gentle smile who had been trained as a house servant. Richard convinced himself he was purchasing Marcus for legitimate reasons. Catherine had been complaining that they needed more help in the house. Marcus's previous owner had praised his skills in letter writing and basic bookkeeping. It made perfect sense. But Richard knew he was lying to himself. He had chosen Marcus the same way he had chosen Joseph, because something about the young man called to desires Richard couldn't control. The pattern repeated itself with horrifying precision. Richard gave Marcus special assignments, long conversations in the study about plantation accounts, evening walks through the gardens to discuss household improvements, gradually increasing physical proximity, testing boundaries, watching for any sign that Marcus might reciprocate the feelings Richard projected onto him. But Marcus was intelligent enough to sense danger. He began making excuses to avoid being alone with Richard. He volunteered for tasks that kept him in the main house around other people. He developed a sudden friendship with another house servant, always having someone nearby when Richard approached. The rejection drove Richard into a spiral of rage and shame. Why couldn't Marcus understand? Why did he have to make it so difficult? Richard wasn't like other masters who simply took what they wanted through violence. He wanted connection, understanding, maybe even love. Was that so wrong? Yes, a voice in his head whispered. Yes, it's wrong. Everything about this is wrong. Marcus became the second body in the basement corner. Then came Isaiah, a field hand with a poet's soul who could recite Shakespeare from memory despite never having been taught to read. Samuel, who sang while he worked and had a laugh that made everyone around him smile. David, William, Elijah, Benjamin, Nathan, Joshua, and Daniel. Each one attracted Richard's attention. Each one rejected his advances or showed signs of fear. Each one ended up buried beneath the basement floor. By the summer of 1847, Richard had developed a system, a ritual. He would identify a young man at the slave market who matched his type, attractive somewhere between 18 and 25, intelligent enough for meaningful conversation, but not so knowledgeable about the world that he would understand Richard's true intentions until it was too late. Richard would purchase him with a plausible excuse, would spend weeks or months in a state of tortured desire, creating opportunities for interaction, building toward a moment of revelation that never went the way Richard fantasized it would. And then, when the shame and self-loathing became unbearable, when the young man's fear or rejection became undeniable, Richard would lure him to the basement. Sometimes with the chloroform he had purchased from a discreet pharmacist in Savannah, sometimes with promises of better work assignments or extra food rations. Once, horribly, with the false claim that the young man's mother was sick and waiting in the basement storage area with medicine. The killings became easier each time, which terrified Richard more than the first desperate murder of Joseph. That first death had haunted him for weeks. By the 11th, he felt almost nothing. Just a cold efficiency, a mechanical process of eliminating a problem. He had become the monster he always feared he was. But Richard told himself elaborate stories to justify what he was doing. He wasn't a murderer. he was protecting his family. These young men were threats to everything he had built. If even one of them had told anyone about Richard's advances, the entire Whitmore family would have been destroyed. Catherine would have been humiliated. His children would have been shunned from society. Thomas's future would have been ruined. Margaret would never find a suitable husband. James and Elizabeth would have grown up as the children of a known pervert. He was protecting them, protecting all of them. That's what Richard told himself every time he buried another body. He was the sacrifice, carrying this terrible burden so his family could remain innocent and safe. The plantation workers knew something was wrong, though they couldn't articulate exactly what. They whispered about the young men who disappeared. They avoided being alone with Master Richard when possible. The older enslaved people warned the younger ones to be careful, to never trust kind words from the master, to always stay in groups. But they were all property. They had no power to refuse orders, no authority to question their master's behaviour. All they could do was try to survive and hope they weren't the next to vanish. Richard knew they suspected something. He could see it in their eyes, in the way conversations stopped when he approached. But what could they do? They were slaves. He was their master. In 1847 South Carolina, his word was law, and their lives were his to do with as he pleased. What Richard didn't know was that one of those whispered warnings would reach the right person at exactly the right time, and that warning would save a life that would ultimately cost Richard his own. But that was still months away. On August 15th, 1847, all Richard knew was that he had found the one who would be different. And on August 15th, 1847, Richard Whitmore went to the Charleston slave market and found the one who would be different, the one who would change everything, the one who would ultimately destroy him. Gabriel stood on the auction block, wearing rough cotton clothing that did nothing to hide the powerful build of his body. At 26 years old, he was older than most of the enslaved people being sold that day. Tall, broad-shouldered, with muscular arms that suggested years of hard physical labour. His skin was a deep brown that gleamed with sweat in the afternoon heat, and his face, even marked by the exhaustion and fear that came with being sold, had a striking beauty that made several buyers pause to stare. Strong back, good teeth, no signs of disease, the auctioneer called out. Been working timber mills in North Carolina. Excellent carpentry skills. Starting bid, $400. Richard Whitmore's hands were trembling as he raised his bid card. He told himself he was simply purchasing a skilled carpenter. That Gabriel's appearance had nothing to do with his decision. That this time would be different. But deep down, he knew he was lying. Gabriel was brought to Whitmore Plantation 3 days later. Richard had prepared a story for his family. They needed someone with carpentry skills to make repairs to the barns and outbuildings. It made perfect sense. No one questioned it. What Richard hadn't anticipated was his son's reaction. Thomas Whitmore had returned from the University of Virginia just 2 months earlier with a law degree he had no intention of using. At 22, he was expected to take over management of the plantation eventually, to marry a suitable young woman from a good family, to continue the Whitmore legacy. He had always been an obedient son, doing what was expected, never causing trouble. But Thomas was living his own lie, carrying his own unbearable secret. He was gay, just like his father, though neither man knew about the other. And Thomas, unlike Richard, hadn't yet buried his truth under decades of denial and performative heterosexuality. The moment Thomas saw Gabriel, he felt something he had only experienced once before, with a classmate at university. A connection so immediate and overwhelming that it felt like being struck by lightning. What Thomas didn't know was that his father was feeling exactly the same thing. And that two men who shared the same secret, the same desires, and the same obsession with Gabriel were about to create a triangle that would end in murder. But first, they had to fall in love. Thomas and Gabriel, not Richard. Richard doesn't get a love story. Richard gets what he's been building toward for 6 years, one final catastrophic mistake. Gabriel looked at him and Thomas saw recognition in those dark eyes. A connection so immediate and overwhelming that it felt like being struck by lightning. Gabriel looked at him and Thomas saw recognition in those dark eyes. Not just acknowledgement of his presence, but something deeper. Something that made Thomas's heart race and his palms sweat. Over the following weeks, Thomas found excuses to be wherever Gabriel was working. He would bring water to the work sites on hot afternoons, appearing with a pitcher and cups under the pretense of checking on all the workers, but always lingering longest where Gabriel worked. He asked questions about the repairs Gabriel was making, questions that any plantation owner's son should know the answers to, but Gabriel never pointed out the transparency of Thomas's interest. Instead, he answered patiently, explaining carpentry techniques, showing Thomas how to identify good lumber from bad, demonstrating the proper way to plane wood smooth. Their conversations gradually moved beyond work. Thomas mentioned a book he was reading, and Gabriel's eyes lit up with interest. They discovered they both loved Shakespeare, though Gabriel had only heard the plays recited by an educated house servant at his previous plantation, had never actually held the books in his hands. Thomas, moved by this revelation, began sneaking books from his father's library, hiding them in the barn where Gabriel could read them by lamplight after his work was done. It was incredibly dangerous. If anyone discovered that Thomas was providing books to an enslaved worker, both of them would face punishment. Enslaved people weren't legally forbidden from learning to read in South Carolina, but it was strongly discouraged, and any master facilitating such education would be viewed with deep suspicion by his neighbours. But Thomas couldn't stop himself. Seeing Gabriel's face light up when he discovered a new book, watching him read with an intensity that suggested he was devouring every word, made Thomas feel something he had never experienced before. They began meeting in the evenings, in a clearing deep in the woods where no one would see them. Thomas told his family he needed evening walks to clear his head, to process everything he had learned at university. No one questioned it. Gentlemen often took contemplative walks. It was perfectly normal. In those evening meetings, away from the plantation's watchful eyes, Thomas and Gabriel talked about everything. About philosophy and literature, yes, but also about deeper things. About what it meant to be trapped in a life you didn't choose. Gabriel spoke carefully about slavery, never directly criticizing the system because such criticism could be deadly, but describing what it felt like to have no control over your own existence, to be property rather than a person. And Thomas, for the first time in his life, talked about his own imprisonment. Not physical chains, but the chains of expectation and obligation. He was the eldest son of a wealthy family. His entire life had been mapped out before he was born. He would inherit the plantation, marry a suitable woman, produce heirs, maintain the family reputation. It didn't matter what he wanted or who he really was. His life belonged to his family, to society, to the expectations of his class and time. "At least you'll be free in a way I never will be," Gabriel said quietly one evening as they sat side by side on a fallen log, the sunset painting the sky orange and pink through the trees. "How can you say that?" Thomas asked. "You're literally enslaved." "But I know I'm enslaved," Gabriel replied. "I know my chains are real, that they were forced on me, that they're wrong. You wear chains, you've convinced yourself are choices. You tell yourself you're free because you live in a mansion and wear expensive clothes. But you're as much a prisoner as I am, maybe more, because you won't even let yourself imagine what freedom would look like." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow because they were true. He had never allowed himself to imagine a different life, had never even let himself think about what he truly wanted, because wanting impossible things led only to suffering. "What if I did imagine it?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What would that change? I'm still the eldest son of Richard Whitmore. I still have responsibilities, obligations, a family depending on me. Imagination doesn't change reality." "No," Gabriel agreed, "but it changes how you experience reality. There's a difference between accepting your situation because you believe it's right and accepting it while knowing it's wrong. One is surrender. The other is survival." They sat in silence for a long moment, the evening air cooling around them, crickets beginning their night songs. "Gabriel," Thomas said finally, "I need to tell you something. Something I've never told anyone." Gabriel turned to look at him, his dark eyes reflecting the last light of the sunset. I'm not who everyone thinks I am," Thomas continued, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. "The man they expect me to be, the man I've been pretending to be my whole life, that's not who I really am. I don't want to marry a woman. I don't want heirs. I don't want any of the things my family expects me to want. I want—" He stopped, unable to continue. The words were there, desperate to be spoken, but 22 years of conditioning made them impossible to say out loud. "I know," Gabriel said softly. Thomas's head snapped up. "You know?" "I've known since the first week," Gabriel said. "The way you look at me, the way you find excuses to be near me, the way you never look at women the way other young men do. I've seen that look before, Thomas. I recognize it." "And you didn't run away? Didn't report me to my father?" Gabriel smiled, sad and knowing. "Where would I run to? And who would believe a slave accusing his master's son of being like you are? No, Thomas, I didn't run. And I didn't tell anyone, because I understand what it's like to be something the world says you're not allowed to be." "What do you mean?" Gabriel looked away out at the darkening forest. "I mean, I'm like you. I've always been like you. And I've always had to hide it, just like you have. Maybe even more than you, because if anyone suspected, I'd be killed. Not just socially destroyed, actually killed, so I understand." Thomas felt his world shift. For the first time in his life, he wasn't alone. Someone else understood. Someone else carried the same secret, the same fear, the same constant performance of being someone they weren't. "Gabriel, Thomas started to say. But he never finished the sentence because Gabriel had leaned in and kissed him. But they weren't the only ones watching Gabriel. Richard had been circling his new purchase like a predator stalking prey. He gave Gabriel assignments that required working in isolated parts of the plantation. He invented reasons to speak with him privately. And every interaction fed the obsession growing in Richard's mind. Gabriel was different from the others, he told himself. Gabriel was special. If only he could make Gabriel understand, could make him see that what Richard felt was love, not lust, then maybe, finally, Richard could have what he had denied himself for so long. Richard began to plan, not murder this time, but something else. Something he had never attempted before. He would keep Gabriel, not kill him, but keep him. He began preparing a room in the basement, far from where the bodies were buried. A room with a lock on the outside. A room where he could keep Gabriel safe. Keep him hidden, keep him his. He didn't know that his son was falling in love with the same man. And he didn't know that Gabriel had noticed something very wrong about Whitmore Plantation. It started with small observations. The way other enslaved workers would go silent when Gabriel asked about the 11 young men who had supposedly run away or died of illness over the past 6 years. The way no one wanted to work near the basement. The way Richard Whitmore looked at him with an intensity that made Gabriel's skin crawl. Gabriel was not naive. He had survived 26 years in slavery by being observant, by reading situations, by understanding the minds of the men who held power over him. And he recognized the look in Richard Whitmore's eyes. He had seen it before from other masters, other white men who viewed enslaved people as objects to be used for any purpose they desired. But there was something different about Richard Whitmore's obsession. Something darker. Something that felt dangerous in a way Gabriel couldn't quite articulate. So Gabriel began his own investigation. He talked quietly with the older workers. He listened to the stories they wouldn't tell directly but would hint at. And he learned about the pattern. Young men, attractive, purchased by Master Richard, given special assignments, and then gone. "Don't go down to the basement alone," an older woman named Martha whispered to him one night. "Don't ever go down there with Master Richard. Not alone. Not ever." Gabriel felt ice slide down his spine. Why? But Martha just shook her head and walked away. What Martha couldn't tell Gabriel was that she had seen one of the bodies. 2 years earlier, while cleaning the main house late at night, she had heard sounds from the basement, sounds that shouldn't have been there. Against every instinct of self-preservation, she had crept down the stairs and seen Richard Whitmore dragging something wrapped in canvas toward the far corner. She had hidden behind storage crates, watching in horror as her master dug a grave. Martha had told no one. Telling would mean death. But she could give warnings, small protections. and she could pray that someone would stop Richard Whitmore before he killed again. She didn't know that the someone would be Richard's own son. 3 weeks after Gabriel's arrival, Thomas Whitmore did something that could have gotten him killed. He kissed Gabriel. It happened in the woods, far from the house, after Thomas had followed Gabriel on one of his evening walks. They had been talking, standing close in the dusk light, and the tension between them had become unbearable. Thomas had leaned in, giving Gabriel every chance to pull away, and Gabriel, despite the enormous danger, despite every survival instinct screaming at him to stop, had kissed him back. "We can't," Gabriel had whispered against Thomas's lips. "If anyone sees us." "I know," Thomas said. "I know, but I can't stop thinking about you. I've never felt this way about anyone." "Neither have I," Gabriel admitted. "But Thomas, your father, there's something wrong with him, the way he looks at me." "My father?" Thomas had pulled back, confusion crossing his face. "My father is the most moral man I know. He would never—" "Please," Gabriel interrupted, "please listen to me. Other men, young men like me, they disappear from this plantation. I've heard the stories. I've seen your father watching me. I think I'm in danger." Thomas wanted to dismiss Gabriel's fears as paranoia. His father was a respected gentleman, a pillar of the community, a devoted family man. But something in Gabriel's eyes made him pause, and Thomas realized he had noticed things too. His father's strange behavior over the past year, the way he seemed distracted, anxious. The nights Thomas had seen him returning from the slave quarters, his clothes disheveled. "I'll protect you," Thomas had said, not knowing how he would keep that promise. "I won't let anything happen to you." But it was already too late, because Richard had seen them. Richard Whitmore stood frozen in the trees, 50 yards from where his son and Gabriel had just kissed. His mind couldn't process what he had just witnessed. Tom, his son. His perfect son who was supposed to marry and produce grandchildren and carry on the family name. Thomas was like him, and Thomas was in love with Gabriel, the man Richard wanted for himself. For a moment, Richard felt a surge of relief so powerful it made him dizzy. He wasn't alone. His son understood what he felt because Thomas felt it too. They could talk about this. They could help each other. Finally, after 43 years of crushing isolation, Richard had found someone who would understand. But then reality crashed down like a collapsing building. Thomas didn't just share Richard's affliction. Thomas had acted on it. Thomas had kissed Gabriel. Thomas had probably done more than kiss him, and Gabriel had responded not with fear or revulsion, but with desire. Gabriel could love Thomas in a way he could never love Richard. The realization felt like a knife twisting in Richard's chest. All those years of denial, of building the perfect life, of trying to be good. And his own son had simply taken what he wanted, while Richard had murdered 11 innocent men, rather than act on his desires. The unfairness of it consumed him. The rage and jealousy and self-loathing all tangled together into something poisonous. Richard had killed to keep his secret safe. He had buried 11 bodies to maintain the illusion of normalcy. And now his son was risking everything, threatening to expose them both for a slave. Richard's mind began to work, to plan. He couldn't kill Thomas, but he could eliminate the problem. He could take Gabriel, not kill him this time, but keep him locked in the basement room he had been preparing. And then Thomas would understand the danger they were in, would realize the consequences of acting on these unnatural urges. Richard would be protecting them both, really, saving Thomas from his own weakness. It made perfect sense to Richard's fractured mind. What Richard didn't know was that Thomas had been watching his father too, noticing the way Richard looked at Gabriel, the special assignments, the increasing obsession. And Thomas was about to discover something in that basement that would force him to make a choice no son should ever have to make. Kill his father or lose the only person he had ever loved. But that revelation was still 2 weeks away. First, Richard had to make his move. On the night of October 28th, 1847, Richard Whitmore put his plan into motion. He found Gabriel working late in the barn, sent there by Thomas with a message that he wanted to meet Gabriel in the woods. But the message had actually come from Richard. When Gabriel arrived at the barn, Richard was waiting with a lantern and a cloth soaked in chloroform he had purchased months earlier for exactly this purpose. "Gabriel," Richard said, his voice gentle. "I need your help with something in the basement. Some shelves that need to be built." Gabriel hesitated. Every instinct screamed danger, but he was a slave. He couldn't refuse a direct order from his master. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. They walked to the house together, Richard carrying the lantern, Gabriel growing more anxious with each step. When they reached the basement stairs, Gabriel stopped. "Master Richard, I don't think—" Richard pressed the chloroform cloth over Gabriel's nose and mouth. Gabriel struggled, his superior strength nearly breaking free, but the chemical worked quickly. Within seconds, Gabriel's body went limp. Richard dragged him down the basement stairs, past the storage areas, past the corner where 11 bodies were buried, to the room he had prepared. It had a bed, a wash basin, a chamber pot. Chains attached to the wall, long enough to reach the bed and the basin, but not long enough to reach the door. Richard had even brought down books, thinking Gabriel would appreciate them during his captivity. He chained Gabriel's ankle to the wall, locked the door, and went upstairs to wait for him to wake up. What Richard didn't know was that Thomas had seen everything. Thomas had been looking for Gabriel, worried when he hadn't shown up for their planned meeting in the woods. He had gone to the barn, found it empty, and then seen the light in the basement window. Through the window, Thomas had watched his father drug Gabriel and drag him downstairs. For several minutes, Thomas stood paralyzed by shock and confusion. Then, moving on autopilot, he followed. He crept down the basement stairs as quietly as possible and hid behind a stack of crates in the storage area. From there, he could see his father opening a door Thomas hadn't even known existed. See Gabriel's unconscious body being chained to a wall. See the expression on his father's face as he looked down at Gabriel, an expression of such twisted devotion that it made Thomas's stomach turn. After Richard left, Thomas waited 10 minutes to make sure he wouldn't return. Then he ran to the locked door and tried the handle. Locked, of course. But through the door he could hear Gabriel beginning to stir, to moan as consciousness returned. "Gabriel," Thomas whispered urgently. "Gabriel, can you hear me? Thomas?" Gabriel's voice was confused, thick with the after-effects of the chloroform. "Where am I? What happened? My father drugged you. He's locked you in a room in the basement. I'm going to get you out. Thomas, you need to leave. If he finds you here—" "I'm not leaving you," Thomas said fiercely, "but I need to find the key. Stay quiet. I'll come back." Thomas searched the basement frantically, looking for anywhere his father might have hidden a key, and in his searching he made a discovery that would change everything. In the far corner of the basement, the dirt floor looked different, disturbed, recently turned. Thomas found a shovel leaning against the wall and began to dig, not knowing what he was looking for, but following an instinct he couldn't explain. 3 feet down, the shovel hit something soft. Thomas dropped to his knees and used his hands to clear away the dirt. It was a body, partially decomposed, a young man, maybe 20 years old. Thomas fell backward, scrambling away from the grave. His mind couldn't process what he was seeing. He looked at the disturbed earth more carefully and realized there were multiple graves. The entire corner of the basement was a burial ground. 11 bodies. His father had killed 11 people, and Gabriel was about to become number 12, unless Thomas stopped him. Thomas ran back upstairs, burst into his father's study without knocking. Richard was sitting at his desk, writing in a journal. "Father," Thomas said, his voice shaking. "Father, what have you done?" Richard looked up slowly. He saw the dirt on Thomas's clothes, the horror in his eyes, and he knew his son had found the bodies. "Thomas," Richard said calmly, closing his journal, "sit down. Let me explain." "Explain what? That you're a murderer? That you've been killing people and burying them in our basement?" "They weren't people," Richard said, and the coldness in his voice made Thomas's blood freeze. "They were slaves, property, and they were a threat to everything I've built, everything you've built, everything our family is. They were human beings. They were like you," Richard said, standing up, "like us, and they could have destroyed us if anyone had found out what we are, what we feel. I was protecting us." Thomas felt bile rising in his throat. "You killed 11 innocent men because you couldn't control yourself. And what do you think will happen to you? Richard asked. "When someone discovers what you've been doing with Gabriel, they'll hang you, Thomas, or commit you to an asylum. Is that what you want? I've been protecting you, protecting all of us. By kidnapping Gabriel? By planning to do God knows what to him in that room?" Richard's expression hardened. "Gabriel is different. I'm not going to kill him. I'm going to keep him. He'll be safe there. He'll be mine. And you'll understand eventually that this is for the best." Thomas stared at his father and saw a stranger. No, worse than a stranger. He saw a monster wearing his father's face, a monster who had murdered 11 people and felt no remorse, a monster who was now planning to imprison and abuse the man Thomas loved. "Let him go," Thomas said quietly. "Let Gabriel go and I'll help you. We'll leave South Carolina. We'll go somewhere no one knows us, but you have to let him go." Richard laughed, a bitter, ugly sound. "You think I can just let him go? He knows too much. He'll talk, and then we'll both hang. Then what are you going to do? Keep him locked in that room forever?" "If necessary," Richard said. "I've prepared everything. Food, water, books. He'll be comfortable, and eventually he'll understand that I'm protecting him, that I love him." "He'll never love you back," Thomas said. "He's terrified of you, and he should be." Something dangerous flashed in Richard's eyes. "And who does he love, Thomas? You, my pathetic son, who's willing to throw away everything for a slave. Better than being a murderer." Richard moved so quickly that Thomas didn't have time to react. He grabbed Thomas by the throat and slammed him against the wall. For a moment, Thomas saw madness in his father's eyes, saw the same expression he must have worn when he killed those 11 men. "You will not ruin this family," Richard hissed. "You will not ruin everything I've built. If I have to lock you in that room with Gabriel to keep you both silent, I will." Thomas realized in that moment that his father was completely insane, that there was no reasoning with him, no appealing to his conscience or his love for his son. Richard Whitmore had become a monster, and monsters didn't stop until they were stopped. Thomas brought his knee up hard into Richard's groin. Richard gasped and loosened his grip. Thomas shoved him away and ran. He didn't run to get help, couldn't run to get help. Who would believe him? His father was Richard Whitmore, respected plantation owner. Thomas was just a son making wild accusations, and even if anyone believed him, the truth would destroy their entire family. His mother, his sisters, his little brother. No, there was only one solution. Thomas ran to his room and grabbed the hunting knife his father had given him on his 18th birthday. Then he went to the kitchen, found the key ring where the housekeeper kept all the spare keys, found one that looked like it might fit the lock on Gabriel's prison. He went back to the basement, tried the key. It worked. Gabriel was awake, standing with his back against the wall, the chain pulled taut. "Thomas, thank God. Please, you have to." "I will," Thomas said, "but first I need to do something. I need you to trust me." He told Gabriel what he had found, the bodies, his father's confession, the danger they were both in. "We have to run," Gabriel said urgently. "We have to get out of here now." "We can't," Thomas said. "My father won't stop. He'll hunt us. He'll find us. And even if he doesn't, he'll keep killing. We're not the only ones in danger. Every young man who catches his eye will end up in a grave. Then what are we supposed to do?" Thomas looked at Gabriel with eyes that held both terrible resolution and terrible sorrow. "I'm going to kill him," Thomas said, "and then we're going to make it look like an accident." The words hung in the air between them. Once spoken, they couldn't be taken back. Thomas Whitmore, 22-year-old son of one of South Carolina's most respected families, had just announced his intention to commit murder, to kill his own father. And the most horrifying part, it was the only moral choice available to him. The plan came together with a clarity that terrified Thomas. Tomorrow, he would suggest to his father that they go hunting together, just the two of them, like they used to do when Thomas was younger. They would ride deep into the woods where no one would see them or hear them. And there, Thomas would do what had to be done. That night, Thomas freed Gabriel from the chains and hid him in the barn. They couldn't risk letting Gabriel leave yet. Not until Richard was dead and Thomas could cover up his disappearance. "After tomorrow," Thomas promised, "I'll give you papers saying I freed you. You can go north. You'll be safe." "What about you?" Gabriel asked. "What happens to you after you do this?" "I inherit the plantation," Thomas said flatly. I become the man my father pretended to be. I marry someone I don't love, I have children I never wanted, and I spend the rest of my life knowing I'm a murderer. Thomas, it's the only way to keep everyone safe, Thomas interrupted. My mother, my sisters, James and Elizabeth, you, all the people my father might have killed in the future. This is the only way. Gabriel pulled Thomas close, held him tight. What if we both ran? What if we just disappeared? He'd find us, Thomas said. And even if he didn't, I can't do that to my family. They need me. Elizabeth is only 8 years old. She adores our father. How can I let her find out what he really is? So on the morning of October 30th, 1847, Thomas Whitmore walked into his father's study and said, "Father, I'm sorry about last night. You were right. I was being foolish. Will you forgive me?" Richard looked at his son with suspicion, but also with desperate hope. "Of course," he said, "you're my son. I love you." "Then let's go hunting," Thomas said. "Just you and me, like we used to." Richard smiled. "I'd like that." They rode out together after breakfast, rifles across their saddles, father and son. To anyone watching, they looked like what they had always appeared to be, a devoted father spending time with his beloved eldest child. Deep in the forest, miles from the plantation, Thomas said, "Father, I want to show you something. I found a clearing yesterday that would be perfect for deer." They dismounted and walked through the trees. Richard was relaxed, happy even, believing that his son had finally understood and accepted what needed to be done. Thomas led him to a small clearing he had discovered days earlier. Remote. Beautiful. The kind of place where a man might want to spend his final moments on earth, though Richard didn't know that yet. "It's here," Thomas said, pointing ahead. Richard walked forward, scanning the trees for deer. Thomas pulled the hunting knife from his belt. His hands were shaking, his entire body was shaking. But he thought about Gabriel in that room, chained like an animal. He thought about the 11 bodies buried in the basement. He thought about all the future victims his father would claim if Thomas didn't stop him. "Father," Thomas said. Richard turned. Thomas drove the knife into his father's chest. Richard stared at him in shock, reached for the wound, opened his mouth but only blood came out. "I'm sorry," Thomas whispered as his father collapsed to the ground. "I'm so sorry, but you were never going to stop." Richard Whitmore, the perfect father, the devoted husband, the respected plantation owner, died in a forest clearing with his son's knife in his heart. His last thought, captured in the expression frozen on his face, wasn't regret for the 11 men he had murdered. It was betrayal that his own son had stopped him from possessing the one he wanted most. Thomas stood over his father's body, the knife still in his hand, and felt nothing. No grief, no relief, no satisfaction, just a terrible emptiness. And the knowledge that he had just become exactly what his father was, a murderer. Then he began to dig. It took Thomas 4 hours to dig a grave deep enough that animals wouldn't disturb it. He buried his father, covered the grave with leaves and branches, and returned to the plantation alone as the sun was setting. "Where's father?" his mother asked when she saw him. "We separated in the forest," Thomas said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I thought he would have returned by now." Catherine Whitmore frowned. "That's not like him. He knows not to go wandering alone. The forest can be dangerous." "I'll organize a search party at first light," Thomas said. They searched for 3 days. Thomas made sure to lead the search parties to areas far from where he had actually buried his father. On the 4th day, he announced that his father must have gotten lost and died of exposure, or perhaps fallen and injured himself in a place they couldn't find. "The forest is vast," Thomas told his grieving mother and siblings. "We may never find him." Catherine accepted this, though she was devastated. Little Elizabeth cried herself to sleep every night for weeks. James, only 16, suddenly had to grow up too fast. Margaret tried to be strong for everyone, and Thomas became the man of the family, the head of the plantation, the one everyone looked to for strength and guidance. 2 weeks after Richard's disappearance, in the middle of the night, Thomas helped Gabriel escape. He gave him papers declaring him a free man, money for travel, and a map to northern cities where he could start a new life. "Come with me," Gabriel begged one last time. "I can't," Thomas said. "My family needs me, and if I disappear too, people will ask questions." "What about what you need?" Gabriel asked. "Don't you deserve to be happy?" Thomas smiled sadly. "I killed my father. I don't deserve anything." They kissed one last time, and then Gabriel walked away into the darkness, and Thomas returned to the house where he would spend the rest of his life pretending to be someone he wasn't. That kiss would haunt Thomas for 42 years. The taste of it, the feeling of Gabriel's tears on his cheek, the sound of footsteps fading into the night. It was the last moment of genuine connection Thomas Whitmore would ever experience. Everything after that was performance, duty, survival. But what happened to Gabriel? Did he make it to freedom? Did he build a new life? Did he ever think about the young man who had loved him enough to become a murderer? We'll return to Gabriel's fate. But first, we need to understand what Thomas's sacrifice cost him. For 5 years, Thomas Whitmore lived with his secret. He managed the plantation. He was kind to the enslaved workers, far kinder than his father had been. He courted the daughter of a neighbouring plantation owner, knowing he would eventually have to marry her. He was a good son, a good brother, a good master. But he never forgot the 11 bodies buried in the basement. And he never forgot that he had become a murderer to stop his father from murdering more. In 1852, when Thomas was 27, he decided to sell the plantation and move the family to Charleston. He told his mother it was because the property held too many painful memories of his father. But the real reason was that he couldn't live in that house anymore, couldn't walk over the graves in the basement, couldn't pretend everything was normal. The new owners, a family named Henderson, bought the plantation for a fair price. They planned to renovate the house, including updating the basement storage areas. 6 weeks after the sale was finalized, the Hendersons began their renovations. The workers who were digging up the old dirt floor in the basement corner made a discovery that would shock Charleston society to its core. 12 skeletons, all male, all young, all buried in shallow graves. The investigation was immediate and intense, but the plantation had been sold. Richard Whitmore was presumed dead, and Thomas Whitmore had moved to Charleston, where he was respected as a devoted son who had stepped up after his father's tragic disappearance. No one ever connected the bodies to Richard Whitmore. The official theory was that they were victims of an unknown serial killer who had operated in the area years earlier. Thomas Whitmore read the newspaper reports about the discovery and felt nothing but a hollow satisfaction that his father's crimes had finally been exposed, even if Richard's name hadn't been attached to them. He never married. He never had children. He spent the rest of his life managing his family's business interests and being the respectable man everyone expected him to be. But sometimes late at night, he would wonder where Gabriel had gone. Whether he had made it to freedom. Whether he had found happiness. Whether he ever thought about the summer of 1847, when 2 men had loved each other despite the impossibility of their situation, and one of them had become a murderer to protect that love. Thomas Whitmore died in 1889 at the age of 64. He never told anyone the truth about what happened to his father. He never confessed to the murder. He took his secrets to the grave, or almost all of them. Because in 1923, when the Whitmore family home in Charleston was being cleared out after the death of Thomas's youngest sister Elizabeth, workers found a sealed box hidden in the attic. Inside was Thomas's journal, written in the years after his father's death. In it he had recorded everything: his father's crimes, his own decision to kill Richard, the guilt he carried for the rest of his life, and most heartbreakingly, entries that mentioned Gabriel. "I wonder if he thinks of me," Thomas had written in 1875, nearly 30 years after their separation. "I wonder if he remembers that summer. I wonder if he hates me for letting him go, or if he understands that I had no choice. I hope he found happiness. I hope he found love, because I never did. I never could. After what I did, I didn't deserve it." The journal was read by Thomas's great-niece, who immediately recognized the danger it represented to the family's reputation. She burned it, along with most of the other papers in the box, but before she did, she copied one entry. Just one. The final entry Thomas had written dated 2 days before his death. "I am dying," Thomas had written in shaking handwriting. "And I am not afraid. Perhaps in death I will finally find peace. Perhaps I will see Gabriel again, in whatever comes after this life. I killed my father to save the man I loved, and I would do it again. But I wonder sometimes if the price was worth it. I saved Gabriel's life, but I destroyed my own. I spent 42 years pretending to be someone I wasn't, carrying guilt for a murder that I still believe was necessary. Was it worth it? I don't know. But I do know this. Love, when it's forbidden, when it's denied, when it's forced to exist in darkness, can turn into something terrible. My father's love became murder. Mine became a prison I built for myself. And perhaps that's the real tragedy of our story. Not that we were monsters, but that society made us into monsters by insisting that what we felt was wrong. The case of Richard and Thomas Whitmore represents one of the darkest chapters in South Carolina's history. A father who murdered 11 innocent men because he couldn't accept who he was. A son who murdered his father to stop the killing. And a society that created the conditions for these tragedies by insisting that certain kinds of love could not exist. Richard Whitmore was a monster. There's no excusing what he did. The 11 young men he killed were innocent. They died because they had the misfortune to catch the attention of a man whose self-loathing had twisted into homicidal obsession. But Richard wasn't born a monster. He was created by a society that told him from childhood that his natural attractions were sinful, unnatural, worthy of death. He tried to bury his true self, to become the man he was expected to be. And when that buried self clawed its way to the surface, it had mutated into something monstrous. Thomas Whitmore made a choice that no person should ever have to make. He killed his father to protect the man he loved and to prevent future murders. Was it the right choice? The moral choice? Thomas himself wasn't sure, and he spent the rest of his life questioning his decision. What we can say with certainty is that Thomas paid a terrible price for his choice. He spent 42 years alone, hiding who he was, carrying the weight of murder and the loss of the only person he ever loved. He saved Gabriel's life but destroyed his own in the process. And Gabriel? We don't know what happened to him. Thomas's journal never mentioned him by name, only calling him the one I loved. Historical records show no trace of a freed slave matching his description arriving in northern cities in late 1847. Either he successfully disappeared into freedom, or perhaps he met some other fate along the dangerous journey north. But maybe, just maybe, Gabriel made it. Maybe he found a community that accepted him. Maybe he built a life for himself, far from the horrors of Whitmore Plantation. Maybe he found love again. And maybe sometimes he thought about the young man who had loved him enough to become a murderer to set him free. Or maybe Gabriel never escaped at all. Maybe the papers Thomas gave him weren't enough. Maybe slave catchers found him on the road north. Maybe he's buried in an unmarked grave somewhere between South Carolina and freedom, another casualty of a system that destroyed millions of lives. We'll never know. And perhaps that's the cruelest part of this story. Gabriel survived Richard Whitmore's obsession. He escaped the basement that would have become his tomb. But history swallowed him anyway, erasing his name, his fate, his very existence from the record. If Gabriel did make it to freedom, he left no trace, and if he didn't, no one recorded his death. Either way, he became what the system wanted all enslaved people to be, invisible, forgotten, as if he had never existed at all. Except in the pages of Thomas Whitmore's journal. In those private writings, Gabriel lived. He was loved. He mattered. And 42 years later, Thomas still remembered the taste of their last kiss. This is what happens when love is forced into darkness. When society insists that certain people cannot exist, cannot love, cannot be who they are. We don't eliminate those feelings. We simply ensure that they emerge as tragedies instead of triumphs. Richard Whitmore should have been able to acknowledge who he was without fear. Thomas Whitmore should have been able to love Gabriel without risking everything. Gabriel should have been free, not enslaved. And 11 innocent young men should have lived full lives instead of dying in a basement because one man couldn't accept himself. What do you think about this case? Was Thomas right to kill his father? Could Richard have been stopped any other way? And what responsibility does society bear for creating the conditions where tragedies like this become inevitable? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story disturbing but important, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell for more dark historical cases that reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature and society. Remember that history's darkest chapters often reveal truths we desperately need to learn, even when those truths make us profoundly uncomfortable. Until next time.